workforce development and the new trends in that field. My name is Ian Flatt. I'm an Economic Development Analyst at Camoin Associates. I just wanted to go ahead and start with some general webinar housekeeping as the last couple people start to sign on. So at this point, everyone is muted to limit the amount of background noise. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, feel free to ask them using the chat function, and we will do our best to answer them, either by directing them to Colleen or I will answer them or respond to you. We also wanted to just get to know everyone that's in the audience, so if you could take a moment and familiarize yourself with the chat function by introducing yourself, so let us know where you're from, what field of work you're in, so workforce development, economic development, nonprofit, private sector, and if you want to let us know the temperature it was when you woke up this morning or went to work. I know here it was negative by a couple degrees, so we're off to a cold start, but I know some places it's even colder. So this, just to give you some background on this webinar, this is the second in a four-part series of webinars sponsored by Camoin Associates on the trends in the field of workforce development and how economic development and workforce development can better collaborate to support businesses and individuals. Information about the first webinar on the role of education in workforce development and the two remaining webinars can be found on the Camoin Associates blog, links to which will be provided at the end of the webinar. For listeners using Twitter, the webinars in this series will be tweeted using the hashtag EDBridgeWD, which is at the bottom of all your slides. You can use this hashtag to join the conversation throughout this presentation or to find out more information about this and other webinars. The topic for today's webinar is the history and role of workforce development and how workforce development and economic development can better collaborate. And our presenter for this webinar is Colleen LaRose. She is a workforce development specialist at Camoin Associates and the founder and CEO of the Northeast Regional Employment and Training Association. Colleen is a highly regarded workforce development expert and a champion of getting workforce development and economic development to collaborate. She has over 20 years of experience in workforce development public policy and has been a featured speaker at both workforce and economic development conferences across the country, including the International Economic Development Council, Northeastern Economic Development Association, and the National Association of Workforce Development Professionals. In 2012, Colleen founded the Northeast Regional Employment and Training Association, also known as NERETA, which has been essential to providing training to economic development and workforce organizations and opening lines of communication between these groups. Colleen is also the Workforce Development Specialist at Camoin Associates, using her experience and insight to assist our economic development and workforce clients. So thank you again for joining us. Again, if you don't mind taking a moment to introduce yourself using the chat function by letting us know who you are, what kind of organization you work for, where you're from, and just let us know the temperature it was when you went to work this morning. And at this point, I will pass the presentation over to Colleen LaRose.
Well, hello. Yeah, I asked Ian if he would please ask us, ask everybody what the temperature is there. I especially want to know if there's anybody who's got over 70 degrees in their area, because we're all freezing here, and I know that there are areas across the country where you're freezing as well. So we thought maybe we would just kind of fantasize about being with the person who's in the 70-degree area for a couple of seconds. It's wonderful with being on the internet and having the opportunity to be able to reach out to all of you from so many different regions of the country. I know we are talking with people from, we're here in the Northeast, but we have people from the South and out West and in the Midwest, and we're really just thrilled to have you all with us. So the topic today, the history and the role of workforce development, I really thought would be of interest to economic developers who are now going to be kind of dancing more closely with workforce development and giving them a little bit more education about who we are, who workforce development, when I say we, I include myself in that bunch, but who's workforce development, where did we come from, how are we funded, what are we doing? And, I was surprised when I'm looking at the attendee list to see so many people from the workforce development community who are joining us today. So some of this is going to be boring to you guys because you already know it, but I appreciate you being a champion, you know, out there working with us on this. And this may, you know, you're free to use these slides in your own region, you know, to talk with other partners in your community about who workforce development is. If there's anything that you want to take from this, certainly feel free to do so. We just ask that you provide us with some sort of citation. So anyway, getting started, we want to start with kind of a real basic understanding of what workforce development is. We went over this in a little more depth in the webinar that we did in December, and you may want to take a look at that. That was a webinar that talked about the disconnect between education and workforce development. And so we defined, you know, both pretty clearly what is workforce development and what is education. But we certainly want to review what is workforce development to begin this. And so, you know, I know all of you can read. I'll give you a second to take a look at this slide. These are a couple of definitions. If you look it up on the internet, you can find, you know, if you Google workforce development, you probably can find 100 different definitions. These are just some that I thought were particularly good. And, you know, mine is very, very simple in that it's really the government system that helps to put people to work. It does a lot more than that, but that's really the kind of the basic understanding of what workforce development is. Okay, next slide, Ian. And so when I say it does a lot more than that, here's a list of some of that a lot more that I'm talking about. It certainly is a conduit between business and education providers, you know, facilitating communications between the two. It certainly is doing the employee and employer matching services for helping people to find jobs and helping employers to find employees. It certainly is very closely engaged with vocational training, helping people to get the skills that they need to be, that especially those skills that are apropos for the employers in their region. It's helping to create career pathways in that, you know, we don't want people stuck on a rung of the ladder. We want them to be able to continue up, you know, their career path, or their career ladder as they used to be called, you know, so that I think we've moved to the term career pathway because sometimes it's not always a direct linear approach to your career. I know it hasn't been for mine. I've kind of taken some sideway paths, but every opportunity is an opportunity to learn, and so that's why we've moved to the idea of career pathways. But workforce development certainly is involved in articulation agreements, and what that means is moving from like a high school to a college, or a two-year college to a four-year college, there are opportunities to take to have credits that would apply, and what we call stackable credentials, so that someone doesn't have to retake a class because they've, you know, started in a different in a different venue or something like that. So that's really what we mean when we talk about articulation agreements. Incumbent worker training programs, what we're talking about there are people who are already employed, but they need improved skills. They need to upgrade their skills, so that's what we're talking about when we talk about incumbent worker training programs. The workforce is very involved, the workforce development system is very involved with that. ESL training, that's English as a second language, and that is something else that the workforce system is very involved with, in helping people to be able to communicate appropriately in American English, so that they can be understood and understand when they're in the workplace. Computer training, certainly something that has certainly in the last 15 years been something that we've been very much involved with. and continue to, even today, you would think, oh, well, everybody knows how to use a computer today. No, not true. There are still lots and lots of people who have to be taught how to use a mouse. There's, what's the difference between hardware and software? Kind of all the basics. We're still doing a lot of that computer training. Even something like volunteering in your community where you can help to gain skills. Many of the workforce systems are very actively engaged in their communities in helping to place people in volunteer opportunities so that they can increase their skills. Certainly if someone needs help getting child care or transportation services, or they lack housing, all of these things are barriers to employment. If you can't find somebody to watch your kids, no responsible person is going to leave their child at home alone so that they can go work. They're going to have help with finding child care, those kinds of things, and that's what we mean by social services supports. So then, the workforce system then gets engaged in commuter trends. Okay, so a lot of times you'll say, well, we have all of these people that need to get to this industrial park, but there's not a bus route that goes there, or it's all shift work, and so we have people coming and going at different times, and we need to have some like a jitney of some sort. Maybe it's not a whole bus that needs to go there, but somehow we need to get people to and from that area. Maybe it's in a more remote area of the community. So the workforce system becomes very involved with helping with transportation planning. We certainly are very involved with helping businesses to expand and retain the talent that they currently have, but certainly helping business to expand is how jobs are created, and especially in today's environment, one of the biggest workforce problems that we have is that there just aren't enough jobs, and so the workforce system is very engaged in helping businesses to access the resources they need, and in many situations that means contacting economic development, and helping them to make the right connections to get the capital that they need or the infrastructure supports that they need, those kinds of things. The employee retention programs, we certainly, as I said, you want to retain the talent that you have, and in some cases, it requires someone from the outside to come in and mediate, to help the human resources department be able to, address grievances that the employees may have. So the workforce system often steps in and says, how can we help, to work with you so that we don't have, a big union walkout or something going on. It's trying to keep things calm and keep the employees happy so that everybody continues to work and everybody continues to have a job. The workforce system does do some connections, some regions more than others, in helping people to find entrepreneurial activities or opportunities. So in some cases, people who are out of work and have not been able to find the right place for a job, in some cases an entrepreneurship opportunity for them would be appropriate, and so the workforce system helps to make those connections, and in some cases becomes very actively involved in doing training on what it means to own a business, and whether or not that would be an appropriate avenue for you to take. The workforce system also does get involved with economic development, with with regard to tax credits for businesses, but they also have their own tax credits. We have one called the Work Opportunity Tax Credit, which is for hiring people who have what we call barriers to employment. So they may have been incarcerated at some point, or they may have been on the receiving social services supports at some point, something like that. And in order to get them off of the public system roles and help them to become actively, gainfully employed, we, the workforce system, can provide some work tax credits to employers, kind of, asking the employer, if you take this person on, it helps us to get them off of the public rolls, and it helps them to become gainfully employed, and because of that we will give you a tax credit. Usually it's about 6 months, and usually it's about half of the person's salary, and it's thought of in terms of helping the employer to train that person appropriately, give them kind of a tax break on on hiring that person so that they can train them appropriately, and help the public system to remove that person from the from receiving the public assistance to going and becoming gainfully employed. And then we also are very involved in career development information. So we help the we work with the colleges, we work with career placement offices, we work with private job coaches, we work with executive recruiters. We're very actively involved in the community in job development and helping to kind of help the people who are helping people who need to find employment. So we are very actively involved with the whole idea of job coaching. So, okay, now next slide, sorry. I wanted to make sure that I went through all of those so that you understand that the workforce system, and it does even more than that. That's kind of like a pretty good overview, but I mean, the workforce system clearly touches on anything and everything that has to do with workforce, and it's for youth, it's for adults, it's for older adults, it's for everyone. And so we become, actively engaged in all kinds of issues that you wouldn't even think of. We probably wouldn't have time if all I did was talk about all of the things that the workforce system does. That would be the entire hour and a half. So anyway, how did the workforce development system get started, and why did it get started? I think that that's a good question and a really good place for us to begin this conversation. So next slide, Ian. Well, as I said, the last webinar that we did, we kind of reviewed the disconnect between workforce development and education. And that's an entire hour and a half webinar. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about that, because you can watch that webinar and get all of the detail that you want about that. But in order to talk about workforce development appropriately, we really do need to kind of address why is it that education is not fulfilling the role of workforce development. Why is it that education isn't teaching people, the skills that they need to become gainfully employed? Why is it that education is not taking on, the barriers and challenges that people have to becoming employed? Well, the reason is pretty simple when you get right down to it. It's because that's not what education is designed to do. Education has four major purposes, and you can see economic is one, in that it's survival skills, reading, writing, arithmetic. We want to make sure that, people are educated and have those basic skills when they, by the time they graduate high school, we hope that they have those basic skills. And I think most of us who are probably on here know well enough that they're having a hard time even getting that part accomplished. No disrespect to education whatsoever, or the people who are not able to learn. I mean, they're just clearly it's a very difficult problem. But education also helps people to understand their culture better. To value their culture, to value the cultures of other people, so to have kind of this awareness of their surroundings, their who they are, what their values are, why they are the way that they are. And then we get to kind of the social issues, which is, education helps people to be able to make intelligent decisions, be able to, when they go into the voting booth, not just be able to read, but be able to interpret, what would be most appropriate for their region when they're deciding, what to vote for. So it helps us to be able to uphold democracy, because obviously, if you don't have literate people, you can't have a democracy. it helps, education also helps people to understand one another on an interpersonal level, and also teaches them the value of conforming. Like, how many times when you were growing up in grammar school were you told to get in a straight line, and, be able to, walk single file into the cafeteria or whatever it was. All of these kind of conforming traits are taught to us in the educational system. And then, of course, then we want to look at the other side of that, which are the personal talents and aptitudes, and try to draw out from people what is it that they are best at, and for them to learn, like, kind of appreciate learning just for the sake of learning. So, just to know, why. Why do butterflies come in so many different colors, and why is grass green, and why is the sky blue, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it's just kind of, we want people to value learning just for the sake of valuing learning, so that they imbue in themselves a love of learning and want to be lifelong learners. Now, on the other hand, we have workforce development, which has really almost none of those attributes. Workforce development really is strictly an economic program, in that it's about providing people with skills that they can market in the job market, skills that they can sell to an employer and get a paycheck for doing those, providing those skills to an employer. So it's very much about aligning the needs of the businesses in the region with the skills of the workforce. It's different, very different from education, in that employers will tell us that what they need are people who are innovative and creative and resilient. And resilience maybe is a little bit about conforming, but certainly innovation and creativity are not about conforming. And so, what education teaches us, and how to get along in society and how to conform, is really very different from what workforce development then needs to teach about how to be innovative and creative. And it also, in the workforce development, we're also teaching a lot of the basic survival skills for adults, which is way beyond just reading, writing, and math. We want to make sure that people know how to act in the workplace. We want to make sure that, as we talked about earlier, about that they have all of the social service supports that they need, and the higher level literacy skills that they need to be able to participate in the workforce effectively. Okay, next slide. So education really has what we call a perennialist philosophy, and it's really more about the great ideas of the Western society, and teaching those big ideas, from the democracy from the Greeks and all of those kinds of, the cultures of the Roman Empire and all of that. We want people to understand the great ideas of Western civilization. And we want to teach them how to learn and why to learn, and that's the education side. On the workforce development side, it's much more of an essentialist philosophy, in that we're teaching them specific skills in how to survive and how to adapt in modern society and in the workplace so that they can survive. So they're really very different, different philosophies and very different reasons for existing. Okay, next slide. So where did this all start? Well, if you go back, probably the very first time that we had any kind of vocational skills training where we used public tax dollars in order to provide those kinds of, skills was probably with the land-grant universities, which came in under the Morrill Acts of 1862 and 1890. You're more than welcome to look this up. We have a lot of slides to get through today, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this. But before the Civil War, we had mostly, it was mostly about, education was all about teaching those great Western civilization ideas, and that perennialist philosophy. And then we got these land grant universities through the Morrill Acts, and that was really where there was land provided that regions were allowed to sell off, and from the profits that they made from that, the sale of those lands, they were allowed to use that toward the education of the people who lived in that region. And so that, again, that was the skills that they were teaching then were much more practical for what they needed in the day, which were agricultural skills, science skills, military skills, and engineering skills. So it wasn't, this was not for teaching the great ideas of Western civilization. That was kind of reserved for the upper class and for people who, could afford to teach, send their children off to higher learning institutions and those kinds of things. This was different now. This was about teaching the regular people who were living there, not the higher classes. This was about the average people in the region who just needed practical skills. So that's why I go to this for saying this is probably where workforce development really got started. Okay, next slide. So by 1913, we had the U.S. Department of Labor that got started, and I think some of this was because of this kind of training that we were doing with workers, and we were starting, we were in the industrial age then, so there was all of this engineering and science and industrialization that was going on, and there were certainly worker abuses, and so the Department of Labor was really formed kind of to protect people from being too abused. If you'll remember back, in your history lessons, we had all kinds of, we had children working in, hot glass houses and doing all kinds. There were no worker protections, and people were being abused, very much so. So in 1913, the Department of Labor started to change that. Next slide. So then comes along the Depression, and we had a lot of people out of work and a lot of people hurting, and there was really nothing that the Department of Labor could do to help them. The Department of Labor was really just a protection organization at that point. They didn't have any kinds of programs or services that they were providing, and so under President Roosevelt, you'll remember probably from your history courses that we had the New Deal that was put into place that came up with a number of different programs to help people through this depression, and the goal of the programs really were that they wanted at least one person, the breadwinner as they would say, in the to have a paycheck in the family, so that every home had a chicken in every pot is how they said it. So basically we just wanted, it wasn't to make people rich, and it wasn't to make sure that everybody had a job. It was to make sure that at least one person in every family had a job so that they were still eating. Okay, and then at the same time there was something called Wagner-Pizer that got started, which was the first time that the Department of Labor kind of started to get involved with helping people find jobs, and so that the idea of a labor exchange service and matching people with jobs got started during this whole New Deal. Okay, next slide. So spending a little bit more time specifically on the Works Progress Administration, this was the largest program in helping people to have jobs. You'll see that there were about 8 million jobs that were created during the 7 years of the program, and they spent about $210 billion in today's dollars in order to make this work. So it was there were 3.3 jobs created during 1938. That's a lot, I mean, it did do a good job. It did not fix the economy, however, and we're going to go over that a little more in a slide later. But people often say, oh, the WPA, that's what fixed the economy, and no, World War II is what fixed the economy. So people wound up, because they didn't need the WPA program anymore because we had gotten into a war, and then people were employed through the Defense Department because they were providing services there. So okay, next slide. So after the WPA program, and that was 1930 or 1942 is when that ended. So 20 years later, we had the Manpower Development and Training Act of 1962. And the idea of the Manpower Development and Training Act was really not so much about poverty, but the fact that there was what we call structural unemployment. And I don't know if any of you remember like Ronald Reagan talking about structural unemployment. We're still dealing with structural unemployment. Structural unemployment is not because of impoverishment, but because of technology that steps in, and then people don't have the proper skills to provide to the employers in the region. This structural employment or structural unemployment issue has been around for a very long time, since 1962. So this is not, we all think that oh, this is new for us. No, it's not new. This is a problem that's been around for a very long time. Anyway, so this program was implemented and was around until about 1973, and then they started a program. They sunsetted the Manpower Development and Training Act, and then they began a program called Sita. So next slide. And Sita is more of a hybrid block program, as opposed to the way that the MDTA was funded. MDTA was money that was given to specific organizations to have people employed. The Sita funding was a block grant program for regions. However, there was a lot of corruption that was taking place with the Sita program. They didn't have any boards that were really overseeing the funding, and so there were, we're all kind of learning as we go, politically. I mean, this is, we're a great experiment. Democracy, actually humanity, I think, is a great experiment. But we all continue to learn as we grow, and some of this they didn't have figured out. They didn't realize that, oh, maybe some people are not going to be completely honest when we send that, big chunk of money to them. And yeah, that's what happened. So they had to put in some protections and the only way really to do that was to sunset the Sita program and start another program. And so that's when the JTPA program started. And that's the Job Training Partnership Act. That's the next slide. And JTPA was largely focused on helping people who had low income, but it did, the really good thing about JTPA is that it did have a governance structure involved with it called the Private Industry Councils, or what we used to call the PICs, and that helped to, it was, both private sector and public sector people who, it was all private sector for the PICs, I'm sorry. There were some public sector people who would sit on the board, but they were not in a voting capacity. Anyway, nonetheless, these private industry councils were kind of oversight over the funding that was being provided to have programs to help people who were impoverished to become employed. And it was, under Sita, there had been some public sector employment opportunities for people. They were not available through the JTPA program. The JTPA program was much more about getting people hired in private sector employment opportunities. So, but JTPA wound up having some issues as well. And I will leave it to you to do the research on that. I was reading about that on Wikipedia today, and there were quite a few issues actually with JTPA. And so it's, everything from, they were accused of racism and again with, not using the funding appropriately, even though they had this structure, because there were some, it was believed that there were some favoritism both at the federal level in how the formulas were determined in order to give regions more money than others, and then there were some problems with the funding level within states, who had the ear of the governor and how they played with the numbers in order to get the more funding for one area than another. So, we had problems with JTPA. So then, then we had to start another program. The other thing that I have on this slide is the Employment and Training Administration under the Department of Labor also started when JTPA sunsetted, and we started with what we call now the WIA, or Workforce Investment Act. That part of the slide should probably be on the next page with WIA, but I want to make sure that you know about that. The Employment and Training Administration, can you go back to that just for a second, Ian? Okay, thanks. It was really responsible for the oversight of what we called the One-Stop Career Center system, and that was, in some ways, was formulated under the JTPA system, in that some organizations that did job matching were beginning to talk with one another under the JTPA system. That's when we talked about those picks, and you'd have some public sector people who would kind of sit in on those, but not necessarily be in a voting situation. But those picks kind of were the first time that these different organizations began talking with one another that all did kind of that similar job matching kind of activity. And that was sort of the basis of the one-stops that then came into play under WIA. So now we'll go to WIA. And I'm going to spend most of this, most of my time on WIA, because frankly that's what's been around for the last 15 years, I guess we're 17 years now. And it's really where we've spent most of our time. And it's what's most important, because although we have new legislation that was signed into law in July 22nd of this year, the rules and regulations for that have not come out yet. That law is it's supposed to be really kind of engaged by July 1st, and so we will see, what the changes are with that. In fact, our next webinar is going to be discussing a lot of what the changes will be from WIA. But again, a lot of the purpose of this webinar was really to make sure that people understood where we've been and what we've been doing. And you kind of need to know that before you figure out where you're going. So, some of you who've been around workforce development for a long time, this is the part that is going to be kind of really boring for you, because you all know this stuff. But the Workforce Investment Act started in 1998 under Bill Clinton, and there were the major points of this legislation were that there would be at least one-stop in every region, and we'll break down in a minute and explain to you what the regions were, and that there would also be these core intensive and training services. Core services meant that when you walked into one of these, what they called one-stop career centers, you were, no matter who you were, no matter what walk of life you came from, no matter how much money you had, you were supposed to be able to receive help with basic resume writing, basic, understanding of what interviewing skills are, basic understanding of a cover letter and a thank you letter to an employer after an interview, and those kinds of things. They were really the core services that the one-stop was supposed to provide to you. The intensive services were, they might provide you with a class. The classes ranged for all kinds of things, but it could be a more intensive resume writing class. It could be a class on dealing with financial issues while you're unemployed. You know, the intensive services workshops could be really pretty much anything that related, again, to your needs, related to helping you to find employment or dealing with being unemployed. And then the training services were a step up. If you couldn't, you know, once you went through the core services and you went through the intensive services, if you still couldn't find work, then they would say, okay, well, we have this small pot of money, and not a lot of people got funded through that, but some would have monies available to them to get specific skill training so that they would be able to become employed. And those, we called those ITAs, individual training accounts, and usually it was around, you know, $4,000, something like that. It was not, you know, we're not talking we're going to pay for your entire college education or anything like that, but it was enough for you to get a CDL or, you know, get a, you know, basic certified nursing program or something. You know, it was pretty basic skills to help you to get a specific job. Or it could be used toward, if you were close to finishing a degree at the college, you know, it could be used toward that. So it basically, anyway, that money was to be used to help you to get skills or training that would help you to become employed. So let me see. I'm going to jump to the next slide, I think. You can read what the other things were on that one. The partners in the one-stop system, and I'm not going to read all of these to you, but I do want you to take a look at this and understand that on the left side, those were partners that were absolutely mandated under the Workforce Investment Act. So these were the organizations that had to become involved with one another and working together. It was no longer, you know, kind of like the way that was under JTPA. It was sort of, you know, you could kind of be part of it if you wanted to, but you didn't have to. Now the federal government was saying, no, these are getting federal monies, and so these organizations must participate in a coordinated approach to helping people to find employment in your region. And then on the right side, you'll see other partners that may have become involved, but they were more kind of like under the JTPA system. They could become involved, but they didn't have to become involved. Okay, next slide. So the WIA, the Workforce Investment Act, has 5 titles in it, and you know, you can read the entire Workforce Investment Act if you want to. I've had to do that on a couple of occasions. It's not really, you know, stellar reading, but it does give you a better understanding. But I'm kind of giving you the cliff notes here today on what's in it. So under Title I, it established the local and state workforce investment boards, and we're going to talk more about those in another slide, so I'm not going to go into too much on that. We talked about the one-stops being delivered. It also established services for youth. There were summer youth programs under JTPA, but this required, under WIA, it was required that there be year-round services for youth, and these were youth who have barriers to employment. This was not for all youth, because all youth are provided services with some federal funding through the Department of Education, and so this was not supposed to duplicate what was going on with the Department of Education, but rather to supplement for young people who had particular challenges in finding employment, or were going to be having difficulty finding employment as they moved toward adulthood. So that was, you know, when I say that, you know, young people who have dropped out of school, young people whose families are on receiving public assistance dollars, young people who have been adjudicated, which is the term that we use. We don't say that they've been incarcerated. Let's see. We talk about the other one for WIA Title I is that there are these job seeker funding streams, and they are the 3 major funding streams for that the workforce and local workforce investment boards were responsible for overseeing, that they got direct money for working with, were adult, dislocated workers, and youth. Okay, next slide. The workforce system has two customers. Under JTPA, it was really just impoverished, if you'll remember. It was, pretty much just people who were poor who needed jobs. That's not what the WIA was. WIA is for all job seekers, regardless of their income. So they can be a PhD making $1 million a year and still be provided with services at the one-stop. And it's all, but there's also another customer besides job seekers, and the other customer are employers. And those employers are, again, we talked to them about tax credits that may be available. OJT means on-the-job training, which is very similar kind of program to that tax credit program that I talked to you about earlier. And, we're looking at the workforce investment boards are the members of those are 51% private sector, and so one of the engagement services that we have for employers is to serve on the board and to provide us with information about their needs, their human resources needs. And then we also provide services for employers with regard to screening candidates for them and providing them with LMI, means labor market information, compliance information, and, apprenticeship, those kinds of things that they may want to participate in for their business. Okay, next slide. Now, the workforce system under WIA also came into its own in that it now not only was being overseen for how it was spending its money, but was it being successful? Were the programs that they were providing actually successful in helping people to get employment, keep the job that they got, and were they able to increase their earnings? Those were the measurements that were put into place to check to see if the system was working, if the money that the feds were giving to create the system, was it doing its job? Was it actually making a dent? The measures for youth were a little bit different because we're not as worried about them being employed as we are about making sure that they are going to be able to become employed. And so it was about really helping them to get some kind of degree or certificate, making sure that they had the literacy and numeracy skills that they needed to be successful, and then it also was about of course helping them to find some kind of job or further their education if we could help them to do that. Okay, next slide. Okay, I grabbed this off of the National Association of Workforce Boards website. I didn't cite that on the slide. I should have, but I do want to give them credit for this. It's a pretty good, and I'm not, it's obviously a lot of detail. You'll get these slides and you can take a look at them. But this is kind of how how the law goes from, or how the rules go from the feds through the state and then to the locals. And so, the Department of Labor, Congress actually appropriates the funding and sets down the rules through the Workforce Investment Act law, through the Department of Labor, then it goes to the state Department of Labor and the State Workforce Investment Board, through the governor and the state legislature, and then moves on to the locals, who then have to carry out those rules and laws and make sure that people are actually, this is the local areas where the actual programs and services are provided. Okay, next slide. And again, I'm not going to go through too much detail on this, but this was another great slide that I got from the National Association of Workforce Boards website that talks about the funding stream and how the funds then move from when Congress appropriates the funding for the Workforce Investment Act, how it moves through the Federal Department of Labor to the state agencies and then down to the local regions. And so make sure that you do note that some of the funds, even though the states are, it looks like the states are taking a lot of money off the top for their own needs, some of that is going for what's called rapid response activities, which is if an employer is getting ready to go out of business and you don't want all of those people who work for that employer to then kind of be, left adrift. And so they put together what's called a rapid response team to assist those employees in finding other work, addressing like what are their transferable skills and how can we help those employees to get jobs with other companies in the region. Okay, next slide. So this goes into more detail about the local workforce investment boards. Local boards can be just like one city. It can be, just like a part of a city. It doesn't even have to be the whole city. It can be a county or a part of a county. It can even be multiple counties. And it can be as big as a whole state can be considered a local WIB. They would be the local WIB and the state WIB in that case. New Hampshire is an example of a state that has just one WIB that is for the entire state, but they also act as the local workforce investment board. Local workforce investment boards, the smallest that you really could get your WIB down to was about 32 members, because if you'll remember that list where we had all of the partners on the left-hand side that were mandated, well, the legislation also says that the Workforce Investment Board has to be 51% private sector. So by the time you get all of those 16 members that are mandated on the left side of that column, then you had to have 17 members that were private sector. And so usually it was about around 32 members by the time you got things worked out that you could get your WIB down to, which is a huge board. And some of the boards were 50, 60 people easily, because every time they wanted to add somebody, remember that, again, that chart with the partners, every time you added somebody from the right column that was optional, then you had to add, usually like 2 private sector people to make up for that one public sector person. So the boards became very, very big and unwieldy, frankly. So the CLEO is the Chief Local Elected Official, and they hold the purse strings for how the funding is used in their local region. And so while the board makes policy decisions and recommendations, the local elected official is in charge of the funding, and they really, because of that, have final say in what gets done in their region. So they do appoint the board members. The local elected official does appoint the board members, and so usually they are aligned in their thinking, but not always. And if there comes down, one doesn't agree with the other, the local elected official wins because they hold the money and they get to decide. Let's see. I think we can jump to the next slide now. Okay, so state workforce investment boards, in the way that you had a local elected official with your local area, the governor is considered the local elected official for the state. And so if it's if it's like New Hampshire, the governor would be both the local elected official for the what's considered the local WIB and the state local official. So you just have one person really that's making the financial decisions for that WIB. They are the state WIBs are responsible for a unified plan, but it was optional actually whether or not they provided one to the Federal Department of Labor under the Workforce Investment Act. That's going to change under the new legislation that we'll talk about next month. And pretty much the statewide system is a mirror. I guess you would say the local WIBs are mirrors of the state WIB in that they both have private sector people on their boards. They're both mandated to have 51% private sector people on their boards. So at the state level, you would think like the commissioner of the Department of Labor or the Department of Education might serve on their board, where in the local region it might be the superintendent of schools that would be in that position. So just you have to think state level, local level, when you're thinking about how these boards are arranged. Okay, next one.
Colleen, could we actually go back to the previous slide, and could you discuss the difference between state and local WIBs?
Sure. No, I just did, Ian. I was explaining that local WIBs are very much a mirror of state WIBs, and so local WIBs, the state Workforce Investment Board determines how many local regions there will be in their area in collaboration with the governor. Okay, so for example, in New Jersey we have 17 local workforce investment boards. In every state is different, and the local workforce investment boards can be multiple counties. They can be one city. They can be one county. However, the state WIB is, for the, is over an overview of the entire state, and so where on the local level you would have local representatives. So if you're, let's make this easy and say it's a one county workforce investment board, okay? So you would have representatives from the vocational rehabilitation county, regional appointee for that area. If it was the state WIB, you'd have the person who was the state representative of that organization. Does that make sense? Am I okay, Ian?
Yes, I think that helps. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. So then we're almost out of time, and I've got a lot more to go through here. So we're going to kind of just skip through Title II's adult education. You're welcome to go back and read through these. Just go to the next slide, Title III. Next slide is about Wagner-Pizer, and we talked about that a little bit. That's the job matching exchange system that's through the Department of Labor. Then we go to Title IV, and that's about vocational rehabilitation. And again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time with this, but these are kind of your cliff notes if you really want to know what's in the law. And then Title V is general provisions, and again, you can kind of go through and look at this, but it really is more about like who those mandated partners are and that kind of thing. Okay, so next slide. Here are the problems that we've found with WIA. There's just not been enough money. I mean, there are a lot of people, especially now, especially since 2008, a lot of people out of work, a lot of people who need the services, and frankly, just not enough money to provide the services to the people who need them. One of the big problems has been that under WIA, there was this idea of put people to work first. That's the most important thing, is get them a job, get them a job. Well, by doing that, we have not emphasized training. And especially with technology being so important these days and moving to such a much higher level intellectually, society, we have not emphasized human capital in the way that we should have. And so we're behind, frankly, a lot of other countries who did continue to invest in training their people as opposed to just putting them to work. And we do have, still issues with regard to not providing enough services to, where JTPA was only for low-skilled, low-income people. Because this system opened up and was for everyone, now we're not providing enough services to those who need it the most. Next slide. Here are some more problems. I'm not going to go through all of these, but you're more than welcome to go through. There were obviously lots of problems with WIA. But again, we're learning, right? We went through the MDTA, we went through Sita, we went through JTPA, now we're going through WIA, and with each one of these systems, we learn, what is it that we tried to implement that works, and what is it that we implemented that's not working so well. And we're going to go over this, what the problems were, again, next month, a little bit more, so that we understand where the new legislation is coming from and why that's needed to be enacted. Okay, next slide. I included this slide, and again, I'm not going to read this. I just think that this is interesting. This is one of those programs that that was put into place to try to ameliorate the problems that we were having with the most recent recession, depression, whatever you want to call it, of 2008. So in 2009, we had these American Recovery and Reinvestment Act dollars that were infused into the labor system to try to help put people to work. And a lot of people talk about this and kind of try to compare it to the WPA program that was going on back in the 30s. It's not really it's something that can be easily compared, but there were $831 billion invested with the ARRA that lasted only a couple of years. They did create almost 7 million jobs, but with the fact the population is only about 2.5 times the size of what it was in 1938. So comparing the investments, we should have been able to put as many people to work with $525 billion. Now, just like under WPA, though, this was not something that was going to solve the employment problem or was going to fix, making sure that everybody had a job that needed a job. In order to get to full employment, the Economic Policy Institute wrote a very fascinating report that explained that it would take $1.5 to $2.2 trillion in order to get to what we would call full employment, and that's just not realistic. I mean, we're just not going to invest that much money, into the labor system to try to help people to get jobs. So, the reason that people compare these two is they were investments of funds into helping people to get jobs at times when the economy was really falling in the skids. But again, in 1942 we had World War II, and that's really what pulled us out of the Depression. We did not have anything like that happen in 2010, 11, 12, 13, 14. We didn't. Fortunately, I'm not complaining. I wouldn't have wanted to live through a world war, but we certainly didn't have the stimulus that comes from a war initiative in that way, and that's why the ARRA funds, people say that it was a failure system. It really wasn't. It did about what the WPA did. Okay, next slide. So this is getting to the difference between economic development and workforce development. I wanted to make sure that we understand that by understanding what the workforce system is, we have to understand its limitations and its contributions as compared to economic development. In the same way that workforce development is not education and it couldn't be done by the education system, it certainly is not economic development and cannot be done by the economic development system. They're very different systems. Economic development really is about quality of life issues, about growth and restructuring the region, improving the overall economic development of a region, where workforce development is about developing the skills and the talents of the human capital that lives in the region. Very, very different goals for these two different initiatives. However, there are a lot of synergies. There are a lot of things that they have in common and a lot that they can collaborate on. Next slide. So this is a little bit more detail in looking at what workforce development does. We've already kind of gone through a lot of what workforce development does. Economic development is more about job creation as opposed to where workforce development is more about helping people get jobs that already exist, right, and getting them the skills for the jobs that already exist. But economic development is about creating new jobs or expanding the economy. Economic development is very competitive. It can be competitive city to city, county to county, state to state. We see it all the time. Where workforce development is a much more collaborative system. We're all, because we don't really have a reason to compete with one another. We're all working together to try to find people jobs. And if someone can't get a job in this region, we're more than happy to help them get a job in another region. So, workforce development, because it's under federal law and as a federally funded system, it's more of an attempt to be a system, where economic development's not a system, and it's usually funded on a local level. Some are even nonprofits. So anyway, you can kind of go through these and see that there are clearly differences between workforce development and economic development. Next slide. So, but there are opportunities. There are lots of opportunities for economic development to work with workforce development. And I love this. I got this from the International Economic Development Council and the National League of Cities report that was done a couple of years ago called The Role of Local Elected Officials in Economic Development, 10 Things You Should Know. And I like this because it really does speak to how you would have to walk through talking to each other, workforce development and economic development. If you were going to sit down and have lunch together, and we do, the Northeast Regional Employment and Training Association for the last couple of years has really been trying to encourage economic developers to take their Workforce Investment Board director to lunch. And we actually call it Economic Developers Take Your Workforce Investment Board Director to Lunch Day. That's a long title. And it's the first Friday in June is when we try to get them to do this. And we really just want them to start getting together and talking about what the opportunities are that they have in their region, and how are they going to get to a point where they can start to create goals together. And this list is a really wonderful way to start the conversation about, what is it that are our strengths and our weaknesses, and how do we fit into the broader, region? What are our vision and goals, and how do we get to those? What's the strategy for getting to those goals? And so anyway, you can take a look at this list, but this is really kind of just a conversation starter, and a way to start thinking about how planning might be done between workforce development and economic development. That workforce development is not just a social services agency. They really can be an active participant in economic development and in helping to grow a local region, because frankly, talent is the #1 reason that a business will locate to a new region. Did you know that? Talent, when we've interviewed employers and asked them, is it tax incentives? Is it quality of life? What is it that makes you want to, move to a region? Is it transportation? Access to, communities that you sell your product? Lots of different opportunities, right? For, why an employer would move to a region. And the #1 reason that an employer chooses to move to a particular region is because of the quality of the workforce. That's powerful stuff, and that really speaks a lot to where workforce development can contribute to the goals of a local region in helping economic development to expand their reach. Okay, next slide. So here are some ideas with regard to finding the synergies. And again, in our next webinar, we're going to go through this in much more detail about the new legislation, what the new legislation is requiring now for how economic development and workforce development really need. It's not just a nice idea for them to work together now. They're actually putting some funding dollars at risk if you don't work together. And so we're going to talk about that more next month in our webinar. But these are some of the synergies that you may want to think about that are available to you in working together between workforce development and economic development. Next slide. So, I'm doing these webinars for Camoin Associates, and I wanted to make sure that we put just a real brief plug in there for them in that, Camoin Associates is an economic development firm, and they've hired me as a workforce development specialist because we recognize that, workforce is the #1 issue that's, facing these regions, and, why businesses want to move to a region. And so Camoin offers opportunities to kind of intervene and facilitate and help workforce development and economic development work more closely together, so they can help you get the right people to the table. Sometimes, if you're on one side, or if you're working in workforce development, you've got certain parties that you work with, but you may not know the people who are working over in economic development and the parties who are on their board. And so, when you have an outside organization that comes in, we can get the right parties to the table and get them talking with one another. We can help you to guide your decision making based on research. Camoin is fantastic at doing all kinds of labor market information research for you, research about the economy in the region as well as your local area, and can provide you with the research that you need to base your decision making on. And then at the same time, then they can help you to facilitate your goal setting. So, when you're having that conversation at lunch, one may have an idea that, we should go in one direction, and one may have an idea to go in the other direction. Sometimes you need to have, a mediator to come in and kind of talk with you about what the research says, and, what the research is kind of telling you the direction that you need to be going in. And then, they can help you to develop the action plans for where you're going to go, and help you to evaluate whether or not you're making progress in the direction that your region has chosen to go into. And, that's a cycle that continues to go, because once you've evaluated where you are, then you want to make sure you have the right parties at the table again, and you kind of go through that cycle again. So, next slide, Ian. So that's the presentation for today. We have about 15-20 minutes left for you to ask any questions that you may have with regard to the role of workforce development, the history of workforce development. I'll answer as best I can, and a little bit about economic development and workforce development and how they can work together. But again, we're going to go into a lot more detail about that in the next presentation next month. So did anyone have any questions?
Thank you, Colleen. I think so far we have one question from an attendee who works in the community college system, and she has struggled getting the local WIB to support their grant applications because they don't always coincide with their the WIB's targeted occupations or industries. Do you know of any policy that would mandate that WIBs can only provide services to their targeted industries, or is that a local policy, is what her question is?
Well, WIB funding, this is a matter of can they help you with other industries? Yes. Can they provide funding for that? Probably not. The funding is tied to the high growth occupations in your region. They can petition the state to get a waiver, to add additional occupations to that list. But the waivers are not easy to get. You have to prove that there are going to be enough jobs available in your region to warrant the training for those. So often, and this just happens way too often in workforce development, we train people because they want training in a particular occupation or for a particular industry, but there aren't jobs available for that in that region. And that's just, it's not fair to the person who's doing the training or taking the training, because obviously they're investing their time and resources to get to that training. They're investing their, what they could be doing, maybe a part-time job or looking for something else to do. They're really investing themselves fully in trying to get the skills for that particular occupation. And then when they get out of that training and can't find a job, it's devastating. And it's also not fair to the workforce system in that, the workforce system is paying for them to get that training. We don't want to have to pay for people to go through training 2, 3, 4 times. We want to pay for them to go through training once for something we know that they're going to be able to get a job in and be able to provide them with that opportunity. Now, that being said, I do want to say we did a webinar in November. We being the Northeast Regional Employment and Training Association did a webinar in November about a new program that's going on here in New Jersey, and we're trying to spread the word about how to help people get a prospective employment opportunity before the public system, the public workforce system, pays for their training. If you would like more information about that, feel free to contact me after this webinar. I'll be happy to put you in touch with the webinar that we did about that and the information about that. But there are ways to help people to figure out whether or not they're going to be appropriate for a particular job and whether that job is going to be available in their region for them before they go through the training program. So I'm kind of going all the way around the barn here before I answer your question. The truth of the matter is, education trainers, even colleges, even if they're public institutions, are businesses. And you are in the business of selling seats. That's your job, and you do a great job at that. The job of the workforce system, however, is to make sure that once the training is done, that people will actually have jobs out of that training. So you have slightly different goals, and so you can't get too mad at your workforce system if they're not going along with you, because they have different rules that they have to follow, and they have different people that they answer to, and they have to make sure that when that funding is spent, that it's going toward someone who's actually going to become employed. Did that answer that question for you? I don't know who that was that asked the question, but I hope that answered that for you. Feel free to do a follow-up if it didn't.
Great. Thank you, Colleen. So we have another question from Director of an Economic Development Partnership in Pennsylvania, and he is wondering how WIBs determine what private sector jobs are available and determine what kind of training is needed.
Okay, say that one more time, Ian. I was trying to find, that's okay, I was trying to find the chat and I couldn't find the question, so go ahead, do it one more time.
He was wondering how WIBs determine the private sector jobs that are available that they should be training job seekers for. How do they determine what jobs are available in their region?
Okay, so they're required to do research, labor market information, research. They get a lot of it through their State Department of Labor. Usually the State Departments of Labor are pretty good about providing accurate information about the jobs that are available in their area. There's a lot of data, however, that they have to weed through, and frankly, the WIBs really could use the assistance of their local economic development professionals to help them with this. Now, that being said, there are not economic development professionals in every region of the country. Some areas, the only thing they have available to them is what their State Department of Labor provides, because there are no local economic development professionals for their region. But if there is a local economic development professional in their region, it would behoove both of you, as part of that luncheon that we're recommending, to sit down and have a conversation about how if the WIB would bring you and say, the information they're getting from their state level, and say, here's the information that we're getting from the State Department of Labor about what those jobs are that are needed to be filled in our region. Does your local information from local businesses concur? And frankly, they can if you have different information than what the state has provided to the Workforce Investment Board, then you can petition the State Department of Labor and have additional occupations added, or have some of them that they recommended deleted, you know, because obviously you're local on the ground, you know what's going on, but you have to prove that you know what's going on.
Great. Thank you, Colleen. So that is the last question we have right now. If anyone else has a question, please feel free to ask it using the chat function. In the meantime, I just want to say thank Colleen for this presentation. Again, Colleen LaRose is a Workforce Development Specialist at Camoin Associates and President and CEO of the Northeast Regional Employment and Training Association. You can see her contact information on this slide, and please feel free to reach out to her with any questions about the content of this presentation. Like we said earlier, we have 2 more webinars coming up, one on February 5th and one on March 5th. This one on February 5th is about the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act and how that will impact economic development. And then our final webinar on workforce development is about best practice case studies on the collaboration that's going on between economic development and workforce development. So you can sign up for those webinars on our blog. And if there are no other questions, I will go ahead and end this webinar. So if you have any questions, please submit them now.
Yeah, Ian, I just wanted to say I'm having
Sure.
a little bit of trouble seeing my question box, but I do see one that says lunch sounds good, but we need to be talking with economic development staff today. June's too late to begin the relationship development. Please go, call them today. The only reason we do this in June once a year is just to remind people, once a year, have you reached out to your economic development? Have you reached out to workforce development? Have you taken an opportunity to get together? And if you haven't, then we're kind of giving you the impetus. Why don't we're making up a day, kind of like a holiday in some ways, for the two. We're giving you a reason why you need to get together, because today's the day we've chosen. This is entirely random, and I just chose it out of the blue. There's no reason why it's the first Friday in June. It could be the first Friday in January. It doesn't make a difference. We just did that in order to try to encourage economic development and workforce development to get together. But by all means, call them sooner rather than later. Get together, start the conversation, and if you would like assistance or facilitation with that, we are here for you to provide that that help.
Great. Thank you. Are there any other questions? Okay, well, thank you everyone for joining us. Please feel free to sign up for our next webinars, and the PowerPoint and the recording of this presentation will be posted to the Camoin Associates blog. Thank you everyone for your time, and have a great day.